Hello and welcome to Cognitations, a podcast about cognitive science and how it can help us explore the wonderful quirks of the mind. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of the mind. It is comprised of cognitive psychology, the neurosciences, linguistics, philosophy, social sciences, computer science, and more. Without further ado, here is today's episode.
I'm today's host, Tanay. Humans inhabit a social world. With the march of history and the discovery of novel technologies, our ability to socialize has been in a state of constant flux to varying degrees. However, modes of human interaction have undergone a massive shift in the 21st century with the emergence of smartphones and social media platforms. According to a Pew report, almost half of US teens say that they are online almost constantly. This is understandably terrifying for the previous generation, especially parents of young people and adolescents, witnessing this shift in sociality. Simultaneously, in the current public discourse, claims about the negative impact of these technologies on mental health and cognition are widespread. But what does the relevant science say? What can it say? Should we really be worried? If so, what precisely should these worries be? Today's guest is here to answer all these questions, or at least some of them. She's Amy Orben. She is a program leader track scientist at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit, also called the CBU, and a fellow at the St. John's College, University of Cambridge. She leads the Digital Mental Health Program at the MRC CBU. She's a multi-award winning psychologist and a world expert on examining how digitalization and social media use impact adolescent mental health. Prior to leading the Digital Mental Health Program at Cambridge, she completed an MA in Natural Sciences at the University of Cambridge before joining the University of Oxford to obtain her DPhil in Experimental Psychology, for which she was awarded the PPS Award for Outstanding Doctoral Research. Thanks, Amy, for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get down to the business of the podcast, we do like to get to know our guests better. So for our listeners, do you mind describing your academic journey until now and how you got interested in the mind?
Gosh, sure. So I've always been interested in science. I remember reading, one of these first books that you give to children about all these different types of scientists you could be, and really wanting to be a biologist because I wanted to work with animals. And that never really changed, except when Angela Merkel got elected. I wanted to be a politician for 2 years. I was quite bored at school, and the scientific topic that was the most challenging was physics. So I was interested in doing that. So I went to Cambridge thinking I would study physics. I did it for a year. And I think I realized that there were people there who love circuits and lasers and exoplanets a lot more than me.
Right.
I think it was also a time where, I didn't have a lot of role models in that discipline, and I couldn't really see my place there. In Cambridge, you can then easily swap into other scientific disciplines. So the next year I took neuroscience and psychology. Really enjoyed doing psychology. I felt like it took the rigor of what I liked and the equations and the scientific thinking, and it's applied it to something that everybody cared about. And I think I always enjoyed working on something that has real relevance to people. And I combined both of those. I think also there is a way that I saw that my talents coming from the physical sciences would mean that I'd be quite strong in that discipline, that we're now emerging into a psychology and a cognitive science that is based on a lot of numbers and very complex behaviors, and that actually skills to think through that in a numerical way were quite good. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because usually the commonplace intuition would be that the hard scientists really don't understand the complexities of human behavior. Like, they think in more structured ways than the human psyche can afford to. So it's interesting you have the reverse
Yeah, I love science. I think what I love is how it merges creativity and almost what's not, and numbers, and they often aren't seen as creative, but something that struck me when I was still studying maths and physics was that even for them there was creativity in doing that. There were specific marks you could get in maths for doing things in a particularly beautiful way, which I never got. I wasn't that talented. And I think that also meant I knew I would never be a first-rate physicist or mathematician. So maybe I'm a competitive person as well.
So, I mean, just tying the link to the work that you currently do.
Mm-hmm.
So, is it safe to assume that you were not interested in investigating social media from the very outset? This is just something that came to you.
Yeah, I think naturally we're very good at crafting stories through hindsight, but for me, social media I started using Facebook at school. I was the first generation where we did have that very late in my school time, but it was very impactful and it was a core part of my life. I got allocated in my last year at Cambridge, we all do a research project and we got to rank which project we wanted to do, and I got given my final choice because nobody else wanted to do it, which was working with Facebook data. And there's a whole story on Facebook data at Cambridge at that time. There was big data sets of what people were doing, that people were analyzing, and I was looking at kind of personality throughout the week and how people use Facebook. And I was struck just by how loads of people were talking about social media in the literature who clearly had never used it in their lives.
Right.
And that's how I felt. I never really thought I would do research. I was quite ill at the time, so I felt like doing a PhD would give me 4 years to sort my life out, and nobody's going to, I wasn't able to do a job in the city like I wanted to do. And so I was thinking about PhDs, and I emailed Robin Dunbar, who was a professor in Oxford, who works in anthropology, and he'd written 1 or 2 articles about social media saying, I think you clearly don't know what young people do on social media. And then he was like, why don't you come over and why don't you do a PhD? So I think it was definitely a slight amount of randomness, but I think it was also a sort of understanding of somebody with lived experience that this is something really big. And I remember telling my parents at the time, like, when I joined Oxford, nobody cared about social media. It was extremely rogue to study, and I felt very isolated. And I remember telling my parents, like, either this will kick off, and in 4 years' time, everybody's going to be talking about it, and I'll have first mover advantage, or it will fizzle out, and I'll have to find another job.
I see. So it was a risky bet on a future that might transpire or not. On a side note, on the podcast now, we've had 2 generations of Robin's PhD students. So we had Daniel Nettle before, and now you're presumably his last.
I was his 51st or 52nd, and final PhD student.
So that's a very long lineage that we are sort of inheriting. So moving on, before we move on to your work on social media and mental health, what is one thing about your work which people can't infer from your academic CV?
I think at the moment, at least, that working in a field that is inherently, working on social media or any technology is inherently extremely political. Research is used for political gain from many different sides of the debate. It's used by companies to potentially evade people suing you. It might be used by legal teams to sue other people. It's used by politicians. It's used by educators. And I think it's taken me a whole decade to understand how political the work is and to start really thinking strategically about how I want my work to be used and how I don't want it to be used. So I think what you can't see from an academic CV is the amount of thought that goes into almost the meta science of doing this work. Kind of, why am I doing it? How can I make sure it benefits those people that I want to benefit? how can I make sure it has the impact that I hope it should have, but also that I avoid it being misused for impact I don't want it to have. And I think there needs to be a lot of care in doing work that is really time critical, but also that where there's a lot of polarization in the debate and positioning yourself there. So I think the amount of time I spend awake at night thinking about these things doesn't show on my CV.
I mean, it's. I'm glad you brought this up because these are some themes that we'll be touching later down the line. So just to get into your research more broadly, we have been talking about the bet has paid off. People are talking about social media and its effects on mental health. And there's a lot of worry in the current cultural discourse about this. Now, I'm aware that people in the literature are aware and have researched a variety of mental health problems that could have been associated with social media. But what do you think are lay people's concerns when they use the term mental health, since it's such a broad term?
And social media.
Mm-hmm.
I think those concerns have shifted over time. So I think at the very beginning, we know that people are concerned about anything that causes changes in our society at rapid pace. There's a really great paper published in Psych Science where I was a reviewer on, I think 1 or 2 years ago, which showed experimentally that people are just more concerned about technologies that were created after they were born than before they were born, even if they were not made up technology, but they didn't have any baggage they could randomize. So I think when I started working on this 10 years ago, I feel like there was a lot of concern of just technologies change how we function as a society, and we are naturally concerned about change. There's a lot of technological determinism, which is what in my area we call that we often see technologies as a driving force of change in our society without also understanding that we will drive changes in those technologies and we adapt the technologies to fit our lives. I think it's very easy for us to link technologies and changes to technologies to concerning trends in society. So in the 1960s, we saw uptick in teen violence, and it was linked to Superman movies or the television. But we also saw uptick in teen violence when the printing press was released, and people linked it to the printing press. And now we see upticks in teen violence, and we link it to grime music or YouTube.
Right.
So, it seems like teen violence is always sometimes an issue, but we're naturally link it to technology. I do think that technologies have shifted in this space over the last 10 years, where people are now not just concerned about that. I think they're concerned about their human agency and how social medias or these powerful social technologies are being designed in ways that they don't feel like they have control over their own behavior anymore, or they show them things that they don't actually want to be shown, and they feel quite powerless. So I think that concern I do find I'm concerned about, that young people say, I don't feel like I'm in control. And I think with mental health in general, we've seen these massive shifts over the last decade in people saying they feel anxious or depressed. And again, people say, what else could explain this if not social media?
Yeah. But then I think that's a good question, which I would throw back to you, in that what are the alternative explanations for this uptick in mental health problems?
Yeah, I think we can start from just thinking about this uptick in mental health problems. So we have seen that, especially in the Anglosphere, in the US, in the UK, we have seen these rises. Even in other countries in Europe, they've been less pronounced. And in other countries around the world, we're seeing less of those. So even those changes, they're not as certain as we would expect them to be, but naturally for example, if you're talking to US context, they're very clearly there in the questionnaire data. Then the question is, what does an uptick even mean? It could be people changing the way they interpret questions. It could be people's actual mental health changing. Could be changes in diagnostic thresholds. And probably it's a mixture of everything.
Right.
And I think that's where then the influence of social media becomes really interesting, because I think social media will be influencing those trends in many different ways. It might be changing how we talk about mental health. It will be changing the stigma around it. It will be changing what we might even think is depression or anxiety or ADHD.
Right.
And it might also make us more stressed and then increase the risk that we will have a mental health condition, or it will change our environment, for example, increase polarization or increase world conflict, or make climate change worse because we're all concerned about something else, and therefore sort of magnify again on that mental health risk. But also I think what we cannot forget is that the last 10 years we've seen other things than just changes to social media use.
Right.
We've seen a global financial crash, we've seen a pandemic, we've seen an escalation of the climate crisis. But
Right.
I think what my answer would be is that I would be surprised if social media isn't playing a role.
Yeah.
The question is, what role is it playing, and what's the extent to it? And that, I don't think we have an easy answer to that yet.
Okay, so let's build on that. So let's get into why we don't have an easy answer to that by sort of reflecting on the current state of the literature. So there's a body of scholars, including yourself, that think that the scientific literature on the mental health impacts of social media is quite messy and doesn't provide clear answers. Can you tell us why in the 21st century, where we can now collect data at scale and gain unique insights into the mind, is this the case? And is there something unique about examining this question that makes it very difficult to address methodologically?
Yeah, I think let's take an analogy. We often talk about the analogy of smoking. And getting to understand whether smoking caused lung cancer took many, many years. And a lot of people argue it took too long. But if we think about smoking, one of the real issues there was that you cannot randomize people into smoking, more or less. And that made pre-existing scientific methods very limited. And it took a long period of time for people to build up a body of evidence where everything is kind of biased and limited, but the evidence triangulated towards that there is an issue, which meant that, triangulation is if you have multiple studies, each was the same with different problems pointing in the same direction. So they had monkeys being forced to smoke and looking at their lungs showing that they were diseased. They had observational studies of population showing that smokers were more likely to die. And then they had post-mortem examinations of lungs of smokers, and all of that pointed in the same direction. Naturally, there was also the influence of the industry, and I do think we really need to think about what we can learn from that. However, if we compare that to social media, we can see why social media is a step up in complexity for probably kind of 4 different reasons. On the first hand, social media isn't a biological molecule like nicotine or tar that you can measure from a cigarette that will have a specific biological response in the body that we can completely understand. The impact of social media or a screen, it doesn't permeate a blood-brain barrier and have some sort of impact on our mind. It's what we see, it's how we feel, it's who we are that determines that specific impact. And that can vary over time. So I could be exposed to a piece of content today. I hear that my friend has gotten a great promotion at work and I feel great. But maybe next week I've just had a really bad appraisal from my boss, and seeing that same message will make me really sad or anxious. So that's kind of complexity number 1.
Right.
I think complexity number 2 is that mental health or societal health is a really complex system.
Sure.
So, and it's ever changing. Social media might be changing how we define it, as well as changing the sort of fundamental nature of it. And so I do think it is different to, for example, lung cancer. And so even if we could experimentally manipulate social media use, for example, turning it off for 2 weeks, and see whether that changes. Is turning it off for 2 weeks going to be sufficient to negate 10 years worth of its effects? Or if we only turn it off for one person, naturally we will need to turn it off for everybody around them for them to get, for example, the positive benefit we might think they would. And so I do think that studying something like mental health or even I think what people want us to study is like, what is a good life? It's almost sometimes scientifically untestable. And then I think the third issue is that we are in a world where even if we, like, it's so complex, but what we could make it easier is actually having good data on what people are actually doing on social media, because we know that might be the active ingredient. And while if I were studying smoking, 50, 60 years ago, I could have submitted a grant and got some RAs and then studied the active ingredient like tar on my monkeys or on my people, or I could have gone and looked at the lungs. Our hands are really tied in this space because a lot of this data and the ability to understand is locked away in commercial companies that do not want this research to take place and that don't want to share that data. So I sometimes think like there's a good reason why we're not getting to good evidence quicker. I think we should be looking for solutions and talking about it more.
Right.
But yeah, I think it's a very, very complex space.
And there was a fourth reason?
I know. I hope you wouldn't ask. I think it was a complex system. I think I merged them into what?
I mean, so just building on the last point there, where the concern seems to be that the scientists in the space don't have access to good data. So what have scientists been doing so far in the space to cope up with that?
Yeah, I think we started with just asking questions about social media use. And I think we often, with any new technology, our baseline is to think about technology. We try to find an active ingredient that is kind of like in a medical study, and a lot of people reverted to time spent. So they looked at time spent on a screen, time spent on social media, because we have the belief that might be the active ingredient that is causing a change in our mind or brain or our mental health. I think increasingly over time, people understood that people are really, really bad at estimating that. And so now there's objective measures where people take that data from the phone or from different apps. But there's also criticism that time is actually maybe not the best measure of an impact. If I use my phone for 20 minutes to do yoga in the evening, that will have a very different impact on me than using it for 20 minutes to check my emails. And I could do either, and I do either very often with my phone. So it might be that we need to understand content. It might be that we need to understand designs. It might be that we need to understand what people experience. And I think we need to match whatever that active ingredient we want to study is with our research question. So for example, if you want to understand the impact of social media on an eating disordered population, you might really want to understand content, because content might be that active ingredient. But if you're interested in anxiety, it might be that it's the amount of likes that people get, or the ability to check on your network at all times through these digital designs that matter for them. And so I think we need to do a lot better at matching what we study to our question and being more specific. And I think that's my one big criticism with how we talk about technology at all times, is that we often oversimplify it. So we ask scientists, what's the impact of a phone on kids? And it's like asking me, like, what's the impact of food on kids? Well, you need to tell me a bit more about what you want to know. Is it junk food? Is it kids' health that you're interested in? Is it a specific population? Is it about the frequency of their meals? And I think that's the sort of detail we need to get anywhere close to, like a proper study. And then I think, and at that point, once we're more specific, we can then find hopefully good ways to proxy measure that exposure.
What do you mean by a
social
proxy
media.
measure?
Well, I guess sometimes we won't be able to measure exactly what we want on social media, or the companies won't give us access to to something.
Right.
And then I think researchers are quite creative people and they try to find workarounds. So for example, I know researchers in Singapore who are creating apps where you feed your Instagram app into the other app. They're computer scientists, so they're incredible. But more or less they find a way to remove the like count feature on people's Instagram to test their impact. Like Instagram would never allow you to do that on their app, but they've created a way that somebody can log into Instagram through another app and then they edit that experience for them. But that often takes multiple years and a huge amount of funding to do so, while naturally Instagram could literally just run that in an afternoon.
Right. So I sort of comprehend the qualm that scientists in the space have, that like screen time might not be a valuable indicator of what's going on online, as you've just described. But it does seem that folk intuition of screen time is quite widespread. Like if we just pulled out our phones right now, it will just literally show you the amount of hours you've spent on a phone. And people do tend to talk about the social media or just digital technology using this notion. Do you think, given the prevalence of this folk intuition, it might be counterintuitive to work against that intuition and rather find creative ways to work with that intuition such that there might be positive impacts?
Yeah, I think screen time it's a really interesting, because as you say, it has a lot of popular value and people really think about it. I do think there are points where screen time is the right measure to use. So I think a lot of it centers on screen time is a valuable measure if we believe that the way to understand technology and its impact is what it displaces. So, which we would call the displacement hypothesis. And this is the understanding that an hour spent on a screen is probably an hour not doing something better, like climbing a tree or taking a walk or going for a swim.
Right.
And partially that's probably true, but not for everyone at all times. And so the displacement hypothesis is an oversimplification. But for example, we are working on a project now where we are using that hypothesis to figure out, is there actually a time spend online that is really unhealthy for kids? Because probably spending 24 hours online, not good, like very simply, and we all understand that that's not good, or maybe even 10 hours because of all the other things that it's displacing, like sleep or school time. So I do think there's some value in time-based measures, but I do think we also need to push against it at times as well. And that's, I guess, where what my comment at the very beginning comes in, which is that political notion of where we sit and why we do what we're doing. I think an experience that's edged in my mind is I went to a conference with loads of social media researchers. I think it was right after the pandemic. And we were all talking about all our different research on how much time you can spend to be healthy and how we lack data. And there was a philosopher in the room he talked last. So after 2 days, he stood up and he said, we haven't addressed the elephant in the room, that we live in an attention economy where whatever people are doing to control their screen time, they're living in a capitalist society where there are companies that make money out of their eyeball time on their phones, like how much they are motivated for them to spend more time on social media, for example. And so by just focusing on the individual and always only studying individual choices, we don't focus on that system. It's similar to just focusing on individuals' food choices without understanding that we live in a world where, if you're a single mom, it would probably be cheaper to feed your children with McDonald's than to cook them a meal because of how our food system is set up. And so I think similarly with screen time, apps have really engaged with screen time limiting features because I think it allows them to put the onus on the user to control their own use. Like, we've given you the tools, like, my iPhone tells me how much time I spend on a screen every week. like, it doesn't really help me. It's like somebody telling me how many calories I eat without telling me how many calories I should be eating. So I think it's pretty useless, but it's a way for the companies to sort of jump through hoops where they're saying, well, we're helping people control their use. So I think there are parts of that where I think we also need to push back and talk about that as psychologists or cognitive scientists, we often just think about individuals and we study individuals, but we're in a bigger system, and our work can maybe take attention away from some of the bigger intractable issues that don't happen on that individual level. So that's my rant. That was slightly left field, but I think it goes back to that, whether we talk about screen time or not, I do think there's a company will that we talk more about screen time rather than addictive designs, rather than problematic business models, which, we feel like we can't change, but like those are where the problems are at more often than not.
I think it also your rant reminds me of the notion of technological solutionism, which is the idea that you first create the problems by technology and then you invent technological solutions to it, and it just regresses into a cascade.
I think it's also there that technologies, we get promised these massive changes to society and positive improvements in the long term from technology companies, self-driving cars, automation, a world where everybody's equal and happy, and almost as a society we're kind of told we should be okay with short-term harms. People being hit by a car that's trying to drive autonomously, or children being exposed to porn. And I do wonder, I bought into that system for a really long time, but I do think that in other areas of consumer products, we wouldn't be okay with that. Like, with other types of non-modern technologies like cars or food. Like, there are other industries that really care about consumer trust and that consumers don't think they're harmed. While I feel like technology companies do operate on a system where they do feel above a lot of those processes. And I think they are. And I think that's where then the notion and the role of what science means needs to be interrogated, and we need to critically reflect on that.
So structural change is difficult, and we can interrogate that in a bit. But let's come back to the individual for the moment. And I want to switch gears and sort of get to this recent review paper that you just published on the potential mechanisms that could link social media use or the affordances that social media has to mental health problems in adolescents. So before we get into the meat of it, I just want to build a conceptual toolkit. So since you mentioned that screen time is problematic, it sort of obscures deeper nuances that's happening cognitively. You propose in the paper that we should look at instead affordances of technologies. So what are affordances?
Yeah, so affordances of technologies, I think how I'd explain them is that there are these active ingredients I was talking about, these features of technologies that will impact mental health through a specific directed way or a specific mechanism. We would call it a mechanism. So for example, that might be specific content that people view, but it could also be that all of a sudden, we have the like count feature that gives me a popularity rating of my feed or my posts that I can easily compare to my friends. And so I think where I want to go with this review article is that we actually have a really good understanding what makes a good childhood or a good adolescent period, what helps young people develop healthily. It's varied activities, it's close personal connections, it's having a school they feel connected to. And we also know the things that make adolescence a period of unique mental health vulnerability. So even before social media, adolescence is a time where we see a substantial uptick in the instances of mental health diagnoses and conditions. And we see the peak onset of many of those as well. So mood disorders like anxiety or depression, personality disorders, eating disorders. And there must be a reason behind that. And they're probably kind of threefold. There are biological changes in the brain that might predispose people because of puberty. And I quote somebody in that paper saying, moving things also just break more. Adolescent brains are reorganizing, and so they are in a time of vulnerability. There's also cognitive changes, so changes in the way we think and perceive the world, and then decide to act on it. And so, for example, young people are in adolescence become incredibly sensitive to what other people think about them. More likely to feel like they're being rejected by other people, and they care more about what other people think. But they also become more responsive to, for example, certain types of rewards. So you could see that might impact mental health as well. And naturally, then there are social changes. Those can be changes to your own sense of self, but also changes to, for example, your body, changing how people interact with you. So people become more sexualized. They start having different types of experiences beyond their family environment, but also they start conceptualizing themselves beyond the family environment. So I think there are all these reasons why that have had decades of research showing why adolescents are more sensitive to mental health conditions.
And this is in an era before social
media
even existed.
Yeah. And so the idea was that instead of always just taking social media as a starting point and then thinking about screen time and how it impacts mental health, let's turn that on its head and say, actually, we know really well what environmental what features of adolescence increase mental health risk.
Right.
And now let's think about what features of social media might amplify that risk in a certain way. And so in the review, we go through a variety of different features, or what we could call affordance of social media, that we have good hypotheses or evidence that might be impactful. So for example, the like count. If you're in a phase...
Before we get on to that, sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to clarify whether you use the terms features and affordances simultaneously. Are they the same? And why do we need a new term? Or is there something really distinct about the term affordances that...
Yeah. We had a lot of debate with this in the authorship team, because the authorship team brought together a communications researcher, a mental health researcher, an adolescent developmental researcher. And it took like 2.5 years to write. It was quite painful process. And for a whole year, everybody was disagreeing with each other. And I only realized a year in that's because the definition of what an affordance is was different across different fields. So in communication science, they do feel really strongly that affordances are distinct. And the way that they would argue is for example, a technology might have a certain feature, like the like button, but we as humans still have agency to use it in a specific way or for a specific purpose. And so an affordance is the perceived possibility of those actions. For example, you might have a specific feature, like people used to have like the poking mechanism on Facebook, but people started using them for very specific different things that will have specific different impacts. So it's not that specific feature, it might be what people are using it for and how they conceptualize of it. But I think if I communicate it to a more general audience, I often equate the two, because it's quite an esoteric difference. Right. But like people, I would invite one of my communication scholars, co-authors on to talk about why, for their field, who've studied media for decades, they do think that, just because a feature exists doesn't mean people use it in a specific way. And so we do need to differentiate between the two, because the impact will always be from what people think, what that sort of more meta level on how it's used and how people think about it, than the specific feature of the technology itself.
Right. I mean, it's also interesting because as far as my knowledge goes, the term affordance also comes from cognitive science. Initially, like it was Norman Deutsch, or...
And we have a very big footnote in the paper going into that in a lot of detail, because that's what we figured out a year in, is that the communication scholar was talking about it in the way that, the baseline came from cognitive science. It then developed into something slightly different in communication science, but the cognitive developmental research from the paper still used the definition from the previous.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so it does, given what you've just described to me in terms of this, what the differences between features and what communication scientists think are affordances, I just intuitively think that it would be much more harder to measure affordances. Like if it's a perception that's evoked by a feature, like let's say the like button, how do scientists who want to measure the impact of social media use in a laboratory operationalize or measure an affordance?
Yeah, I guess you might still operationalize it as how much the feature is used.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's just like do you ask questions like how many times do you use the like button? Is this?
Yeah, I guess, I don't know. You probably, if you want to measure so for example, what we would call the affordance that is involved with the like button, we would probably call the quantification of social feedback. Because quantification of social feedback doesn't need to be the like button. It could also be, it could be on a different app. It's called something else, or it could be the little hand give emoji. They all are similar, which is that we quantify people's reactions to our posts or what we share. And the way that's measured, I think, needs a lot of thought, because in some studies it might mean you want to experimentally manipulate that through manipulating, for example, a feature, or you might ask them questions about how that affordance impacts them. So for example, in my team, we have just analyzed some questionnaire data where people are asked, how much does likes impact your mood, or how much does getting feedback from others on social media impact your mood? And so you're getting at it in different ways. But the affordance would be quantifiability, like the quantification of feedback, while then the features underneath that could be the like button, it could be something slightly different, it could be on one app, it could be on a different app. And then the way you measure it is a question for the person who's designing the study.
Gotcha. So just jumping on a previous thread of thought where you sort of described that adolescence is this period that's sort of rife with vulnerabilities to mental health problems, and you describe these three levels of mechanisms. That is the behavioral mechanisms, you have the cognitive mechanisms, and you have the neurobiological mechanisms. So maybe let's get a bit more concrete about that. Could you talk about specific examples of behavioral mechanisms that link affordances, as we have just discussed, of social media to adolescent mental health problems?
Yeah. So, for example, we know adolescence is a time of risk-taking. So young people take risks. And actually that might increase their mental health risk, but it's also a core developmental stage.
Right.
So that might mean doing risky, for example, risky sexual activities or social activities. And I was just struck earlier today, I read an article that I think 12.7% of young people in Australia say that they've had a nude picture of them shared without their consent.
Wow.
So there you can see that you could say the online world magnifies the risk of risk-taking on mental health, because all of a sudden we have permanent instantiation of that behavior, for example, through photos or videos.
Right.
And we have a system where those are shareable at scale or shareable over long periods of time.
Right.
And so those are two affordances. We would say permanency, that our actions aren't transient. They don't just happen and they're over. They often have long-term footprints. And also scalability, so that posts can be shared at scale to that, you've never been able to do that before. So you might do something slightly embarrassing and all of a sudden the next day your whole school knows.
Right.
Or not even just your whole school, like your whole county.
Right.
And I think that's a level where it's very easy there to argue that, yeah, social media and the specific affordance of it will magnify that risk for young people.
Right. But then I think implicit in your explanation here seems to be the case that, adolescents are sort of vulnerable to risky posting because they've always done so. But has there been some change in perceptions of adolescents where they sort of know that this happens and maybe they have come up with ways to tackle this?
Yes, so, and I think there we also need to understand that young people have agency in the world, and they are individuals in their own right to make choices. And I think this paper really just looks at the risks. We don't also look at the benefits, because you could see points where, young people can now use social media and the scalability and publicness of it to organize things like Friday for Future, or to advocate for things they care about. So I think that's one part where we just really look at mental health risk, but we completely overlook that naturally all of these could also be used for benefit. I think we cover it a bit, but naturally young people also create ways to safeguard themselves. So Emily Weinstein, in her book Behind Their Screens, talks about young people watermarking, for example, the news that they send each other. And now sending nude photos is just part and parcel of the way that they express their sexuality, for better or for worse. That it's now really part of that culture. But some of them, for example, put like watermarks on it so they know who they sent it to. So if it's leaked, they can say like, oh, you leaked that. Right. Which, for better or for worse, I think shows that a lot of them do understand risk. It's just that they weigh the risks up differently. Young people really care about things like social inclusion and being accepted in their peer group. And so, like with smoking, still now, more so a couple of decades ago, they very well knew or know the harms of smoking. But when somebody offers you a cigarette at the party, the immediate harm, the social harm of saying no, just outweighs like me getting cancer when I'm 60. Right. And I think it's similarly for social media. So I think any interventions or the way we address that system, we need to understand that they're making those choices all the time. And they often do understand the risk. It's just that other risks are more important for them, even if they're less important for kind of us as adults. Right.
No, those two examples were really illustrative. So let's move on to the cognitive mechanisms now. What are the cognitive mechanisms that link affordances to teen mental health?
Yeah, I think the one that I'm really interested in is this quantification of social feedback, and we've done quite a bit of work on that. So if you're in a phase of your life where you really care about where you feel rejected more quickly, and there's been really nice neuroimaging and experimental work showing that out of the US, then if you are now in an environment where you get quantified social feedback, that changes that nature of that feedback. It makes it more certain. There's less uncertainty. So if I wear a new outfit to school, in an offline world, I actually need to do a lot of very complex social inference to understand what people are thinking about my new outfit. I need to read their facial expressions. Somebody might tell me something, but it's often what people don't say that matters. And especially if you're in the UK, it took me a couple of years to understand that jumper is interesting means it's horrendous. So there's a lot of kind of difficulty there. But if I normally post pictures and I get 100 likes and now I get 2 or I get 400, that's a really certain stimulus of popularity for better or for worse. Right. And so I think we can really integrate that into our models of how people update their beliefs and how people make decisions, that there is now an environment where certain types of information becomes more certain, like social feedback, like popularity. Naturally, there'll be times where a like is difficult to interpret, but I do think there's a power of a quantified number of likes, and I think it's, at least I've find it impossible to not check my social media when I've just posted to see that number going up, and I think a lot of us will feel the same.
Right. I mean, it's quite interesting how certainty has a negative mental health effect here, because it flips that old religious credo where usually it's uncertainty that people are scared of, and you're seeking certainty. But it seems like in the social world, this sort of plays a very different role.
Yeah, I guess we have a senior postdoc of mine, Dr. Amanda Ferguson, has a paper in Trends in Cognitive Sciences where she talks about certainty and uncertainty. And I think there are parts of the online social world that also makes things more uncertain. So, for example, if I need to make judgments about what other people are thinking, the online world does magnify that uncertainty in certain ways. So, for example, if I'm a young person and I've texted my friend and they don't reply, it's really difficult for me to gauge whether they're mad at me or not. They might be asleep, their parents might have taken their phone away from them, they might be mad at me, but there's a dearth of social cues that make that very difficult. And so we do see young people ruminating for long periods of time, trying to make sense of the online world around them. While in real life, because there is, the way that our social norms are set up, you normally reply when somebody talks to you. If then your friend walks off and doesn't reply, you have other social cues that will allow you to understand that. So I do think there is a huge amount of uncertainty there as well. And also what interests me, and I haven't studied, is that there's a huge amount more of information that young people could gather. So if you are interested in somebody romantically, for example, you used to be able to sort of follow them around at school, but now I can, of young people tracking how many followers they have, and when it goes up or down, trying to figure out who'd followed them, who'd haven't. You can follow locations, you can follow what people spend money on their apps, and so you can go into a lot more cognitive effort to keep track of your social status, important people in your social group. I think that just takes a lot of time and cognitive resources. And so I do feel for young people where, now there are, in a time where you really care about your status, you now have a system where you could get more and more and more information about your social world. And almost you need to be, in a way, find a time where to stop engaging. And so the Max Planck Institute in Berlin is bringing out some really nice papers about disengagement with information on social media, mainly about things like health or political things. But I think it also is in this space that we now live in a world of unlimited information. So there's also a skill of knowing when to stop seeking it. So I think certainty, uncertainty, information, that's what makes this such an incredibly interesting place to study, because we have an environment that is inherent. The online environment is very, very different from the offline environment. We have very targeted hypotheses we could raise. And actually, if we see that something is harmful or not, there could be a world where that's different. There could be regulation that could be enacted to change that. While, the way we talk and our social norms are much harder to change.
Interesting. So let's move on to the neurobiological mechanisms now.
I feel like it's a test.
the three-pronged approach.
Yeah, I think that was the one where we had the most debates whether to keep this in or not. But for example, I wanted to keep this in because we do know that adolescence is a time where stress, for example, really does predict sensitivity to mental health conditions. Just on a biological level, the HPA axis, which is sort of what, neural axis from the brain to the rest of the body where stress can be, cause a lot of impact, is in a real state of flux, and your brain is in a state of flux. So just in a system that increases stress by 5%, regardless of whether that's social media or not, will probably have some sort of outcome. So on the biological level, my argument was that it doesn't even need to be specific activities or social media or time. It could be just that social media increase the stress level by a certain amount, and you're at a time where there's a specific biological sensitivity to stress can lead to, for example, certain outcomes. Or it's the same with sleep. You're in a time where there are specific biological changes that mean that sleep is more likely to be disrupted. And so if that you increase a bit of stress on that system at a specific vulnerable period of time can have long-term consequences. But I think there was a time where that paper was set up in a way where it's like that part was all about that. It really doesn't even have to be social media. It could be anything, but we think this could be social media playing a role. Yeah.
But like what, I guess, taking a leaf out of your notebook, what specific aspects of social media do you think would increase stress? Is it the things that we talked about with respect to uncertainty?
I think a lot of those can do. I think also, like I've been thinking a lot about social media even changing governments, changing which political party gets voted in, changing how close conflict feels to young people. For example, in qualitative work with young people, they often talk about all this disturbing content that they see about conflicts that are very far away from them, that used to be moderated through traditional print or broadcast media. So I would potentially see, bombing or a national catastrophe. But now we see people talking on TikTok about their homes burning down or their family being killed. And so even that, I think, will have an impact. But yeah, it's very hard to prove on those levels. But I think what I want to argue in this piece and in the work at the moment is that just from first principles, we can piece together that there are probably specific features of social media that will amplify risk through different pathways, biological, cognitive, or social. I think and my hope was to change that conversation a bit with that article. Whether, each of the pathways I show is the right one, or I'll have left some out. Maybe there's different levels we need to consider. So I'm not wedded to that, but I'm wedded to the idea that we would do a lot better as cognitive scientists, at least, or even as psychologists or behavioral scientists more generally, that we shouldn't study social media as something completely new. We should stay with what we know really well, like what predicts mental health, how we interact with environments, the biological and cognitive models we've developed over generations of researchers about how we make decisions. And then we should understand how that online world interfaces with it in specific ways, instead of treating it as something like completely new that we need to study in very different ways. And then we don't have a theoretical backing or literature backing to back it up. And our science takes a lot longer and is more mixed and has more issues to do with it.
So I mean, we didn't obviously go through all the mechanisms. You have this table in the paper that lists all the potential mechanisms that would link social media use to adolescent mental health. And even with what we covered, that was a mouthful. You felt like you were being tested. And so I do wonder, given that there's also this sense of urgency in the public where people want answers about this broad question of how social media is affecting mental health right now, rather than letting science take its own course. So are there, out of these mechanisms that we have talked about, are there some mechanisms that you privilege more over the others, where you feel like if we address these mechanisms, we really have a crack at opening up and solving this big picture question?
I think we need to think about what we do research for and why. So, and on what time scales. So I think we should be doing research on many different time scales. So on the long time scale, yes, a lot of basic research I think should get done, but it's not going to solve people's problems now. Maybe even any work on mechanisms won't. So I think what we need to complement this basic research with is much more targeted research based on what are we going to do to solve immediate problems. So, for example, one of those that I argue for in when I talk to people is that we should do much more intervention work. So instead of doing loads of low-level cognitive studies, actually just testing whether putting your phone in a drawer at night helps kids, it's probably a really good use of our time, because that would test one specific recommendation that parents are specifically using, or testing when states enact changes and using that. So I think there's no one silver bullet, because we need like multiple silver bullets for different questions and different parts of the ecosystem of science we need to do to solve problems at different timescales for different sorts of people. So I don't think there's like one mechanism I think overall would work the best. I actually think if we want to solve things now, we shouldn't do mechanistic work. We should be doing interventions, or we should be doing reviews, and that's what we're doing. But I do think that doesn't mean I think the mechanistic work might get us in 3-4 years' time in a much better place to inform debates that we'll have about designs, about designing a better internet for humanity. So I think that's why in my team we both do a lot of basic research, and you are a PhD student in that team, so like for the audience, but we do a lot of this sort of basic research, which has much longer timescales, but then we complement it with much more short turnaround applied work, which I would say for me is conceptually very different, because it's trying to solve different problems.
I do want to bring in another line of thought here. I mean, I do definitely see the value of interventionistic work, as you mentioned, in the long term, where you can just see, if you want to think about the future of the internet, what a good internet might look like. But we do have another line of evidence from whistleblowers like Frances Hogan, who sort of showed for the audience some mental health effects that Facebook/Meta knew about of Instagram on teenage girls. And there have been other such whistleblowers/people who have looked into the sociology of these companies, or have given insider reports of what's going on in these companies. Is diverting funding towards interventionistic research a way? I don't think the intention is to invalidate the whistleblowers, but do you think it might lend to the perception that what the whistleblowers are saying are not true? Does that make sense?
It does. I don't think it. My hope would be that the intervention work will allow us to test, for example, specific recommendations to parents or to people about how, for example, they can feel more agency about their use, or what tool they can use to counteract a specific design that we think might be concerning. So I think you can design intervention work in a way that it empowers people and therefore kind of empowers the system. So I think because there's an inherent pushback on whistleblower work, because it's all behind closed doors as well, I think just repeating similar things in the open, I also don't think is a waste of funds. I think it also shows that the political value of figuring out a system where this sort of work can be done on company servers at scale, or where this is part of public safety testing that companies need to go through. I think it's really crucial. I think that's why I'm quite careful in how I answer that question. I think it's very crucial that that science doesn't alienate people's personal experiences, and it doesn't alienate other parts of the system that are fighting for positive change. And I think as scientists, we often really think about, for example, the quality of evidence and advocate for better quality evidence. But in this space, it often means that we have to say that the evidence quality is pretty rubbish.
Right.
And like how we do that and how we communicate, I think it's really critical to do right. And I think it's something I've really reflected on. So I wish there's a system where whistleblowers, parents that are concerned, civil society groups, and researchers can work together without us having to say that there is good evidence when there isn't, because the system is so complex. And getting to really good evidence at the moment is almost nigh impossible, at least in the time scales that we will need to inform the regulations or the interventions that people want. So I think that's why science in this space is in a really, really difficult situation. And I think we need to be, as I think your question alludes to, we need to be very careful what we do, what we don't do. I don't think I always have the answers either, but I do think that carefully crafted intervention work can be really powerful at least us understanding what sort of recommendations or policy can be scaled up rapidly. And I do believe in evidence-based policy. I do believe that we cannot just change things and see what happens, and that we should test them out beforehand. And that will always be intervention work as well.
So, I mean, I can imagine if there are some parents tuning into this podcast, listening to this, and knowing that the current state of evidence is kind of shaky, they would still be wondering, well, given this current state of evidence, what are some things that you can do right now? Do you have any advice or recommendations there?
Yeah, I completely understand parents, and I think there's a lot of frustration in this space at the moment because parents are incredibly concerned, and often with research, we left being like, oh, there's not clear evidence, and that's, I think we need to change that, and we need to change that rapidly, but it's a lot of thinking. I don't think I have the answers. I think there needs to be political will of really funding this research well, about giving us the data that we need and holding companies to account that I don't think is there at the moment. So we're left to picking up the scraps. So I feel for parents. I think my recommendations align with those of the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health. They talk about that there are core things in your child's life that are really important. Things like sleep, things like eating healthily, things like spending time with family, and ensuring that screens don't impact those. And safeguarding those is, I think, critical. So ensuring that if phones in bedrooms is a problem and you think that is an issue in decreasing sleep, why not test out having phones out of the bedroom and seeing whether that helps. The same with phones at meal times, and allowing that there are family social functions that are, where maybe that can be playing a video game together, but it shouldn't be you all playing video games separately at different screens. So I think it's about understanding and making that judgment as a family. And I think the understanding there is that because the impacts of screens are so diverse, the person who can make that best judgment about that child is the parent. So I don't know whether you're the gamer family who really loves playing video games together, then that screen time is probably really beneficial for your child. But if you're not that kind of family, then probably the same amount of use would have a very different effect. But what we know is we know what the core building blocks are of a good childhood: varied activities, healthy eating, good amount of sleep, and close family bonds, and ensuring that those are safeguarded and augmented by screens in a positive way. I know that's not really what people want to hear, but I think that's where we are. I think the other critical thing to talk about is that in adolescence and in childhood, things always go wrong. And things go wrong more the older young people get, and because they spend so much time online, things will go wrong online as well. And so you need to create a system where there's trust, that the young person can share that with somebody who's a trusted person. And I think often young people feel more concerned talking about when something happens in the digital world because they think that, for example, they'd get their phone taken away from them, or that they just wouldn't understand. And so I think there needs to be built a conversation about technology and a trust between the caregiver and the child that will allow them to disclose when something has gone wrong. Because I think, like with any part of the child's life, things will go wrong, and because so much of their life is now online, that will also happen online. So those are my two things.
No, that does, especially the bit about the core building blocks do seem like useful heuristics. I mean, just a quick question on that, since we were talking about since you mentioned these core building blocks, it does seem like there are other people who are also quite vocal in the space, like Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge, who have sort of also shaped the cultural discourse apart from yourself on this issue to a certain extent. And at least from a distance, to me, it seems like the cultural zeitgeist has painted a picture of the both of you as opposing each other, whereas what I can gather from the things that we have discussed, there seem to be more similarities rather than differences. Would you agree, or are there some genuine differences there?
Yeah, I think, when I started off in this space in, I think it's almost 10 years now, the conversation about technologies were incredibly simplistic.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were sort of there was a sort of amount of kind of us versus them in that space at that time. I think also technologies was very different
Right.
as we are now. I think things like the introduction of the reel structure on TikTok and the changes in the political landscape and the politicization of technology companies have changed my opinions on what can be safe or not. I think my opinions have also shifted because over 10 years, I think what makes cigarettes different from technology is that we could make technology safe. If we had the industrial and political will in the room, we could make technology that is safe and that can deliver interventions that will transform education, that could solve loads of our issues.
Right.
But I increasingly feel like that hasn't been done, and I don't see that being done. And I think then, therefore, the way we talk about these things needs to change, because all of a sudden, even though it is a mutable thing that could be positive, my feeling is that I'm not confident that we are in a space where that would happen. And all of a sudden, that means we need to talk about it slightly differently. I think, so I do recognize that there's been a shift in what I was talking about, probably from about 2015 to 2020. I think in the last 5 years, I do find we're similar. I think there's more similarities than differences here, in that I think everybody recognizes the level and the state of evidence. Naturally, there's some political posturing in this space, but if you get people in the room, I would probably argue that people would feel pretty similar. But I think people have different, what I would call kind of a false positive or false negative rate, and like, when do we say that evidence is clear? And do we change that because we're in that space where we feel like there's so much hanging on that? So traditionally, being sort of a really robust, good researcher meant not always saying, well, the evidence isn't clear yet, if the evidence isn't clear yet. And I think that's where people like Jonathan and Jean would say, well, we need to act now. So the best way to say that is then to say that the evidence is there and we therefore need to act. I have this hope, and I might be wrong, and it might be something that I regret, but I wish there was this position in this debate where you could be a scientist that doesn't compromise on that value of being able to say whether evidence is good or not. And I see my job as being representing the data and the science, but crafting a space in that debate where you can then still argue for change, because you talk about whether we can even deliver that high level of evidence, whether the risk of not doing something now outweighs the risk of doing something and potentially the technology not being harmful anyways. And so I think a lot of my work over the last year or year and a half has been to conceptualize how might that look like. So I think you're right that there is a lot of commonality. I think there's still a lot of polarization. And there's a lot of painting people into different camps. But I guess I've tried to exclude myself from that for a year, and I think I'm ready to re-enter that conversation sooner rather than later. I would hope that to craft that sort of niche there of still being able to represent the data, but not inherently then being pro digital technology companies, because good quality evidence of harm, I think, isn't obtainable with the current resources and time we have available, if that makes sense.
No, it does. I mean, but then wouldn't you say that, I mean, they have taken a very different stance in terms of how they think the state of evidence merits action or immediate action, but they might have inadvertently created some opportunities for natural experiments, which might end up helping the field.
Yeah, and I always say I think that's where, there are some people who feel really strongly about the social media ban being rubbish in Australia because, for example, WhatsApp is still included and kids would just use WhatsApp,
right.
Or there are rural kids that won't have access to social media anymore. And I completely understand their point. I completely also see the other side where it's like, well, maybe if we just remove it, there might be a positive benefit on the whole. And I think any policy change will have harms and benefits. There's never a policy that doesn't harm someone. It's a politician's decision to decide whether, the harms outweigh the good or the good outweigh the harms. And so I actually enjoy that work with government because so I'm on the fence with that one. So I do think that they have caused a huge amount of conversation. They've put pressure on companies. We saw Meta releasing Instagram teen accounts, naturally only in countries in the global north that were putting pressure on them. So I think we need to make sure that this trickles down to the global community who, are the majority of users. So we should have a system that actually is, works for them first. So I think that's a whole nother conversation to have. But yeah, I do think that, especially Jonathan is an incredibly adept political actor, and I think that's what he is. And then you have to work with that as somebody in that ecosystem. What I am concerned about is that I'm seeing that debate go... It's like, I'm worried about us throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and that screens, I still deeply believe that screens can be good. And that they can solve a lot of different problems. They can provide access to healthcare, to banking. They can revolutionize people's lives. They can keep people safe. Like I don't think there should be an argument that a child who's a refugee or who's experiencing war should have a smartphone. Like taking that away from them would, I think, be inhumane just because they might be looking on social media. Also, I think that researchers, foundations, big funders have spent millions and billions of pounds in developing really good educational technologies that allow us to address some of the biggest challenges we face in our educational system. In the UK, that might be, how do we address that? There are now 25-30% of children with special educational needs, but only one teacher. In Ukraine, that might be, how do we deliver education in a war-torn country?
Right.
In India, that might be, how do we scale education to an ever-increasing population? And I think screens will play a part in that. And I do worry that fervor of the conversation that people like Jonathan have had to create to push for the change they want is spilling over into those types of technologies that I think are unarguably positive. So I think there's also a sort of way of like, how can we take that, get the positive, but ensure that we're not holding ourselves back by saying that all screens are bad, because they're not. They're bad actors. Yes, let's hold them to account, but there's also, I don't think we're going to solve our world's problems without technology either.
Well, that's a great note to wrap things up on. So before we wrap up, is there anything that you would want to clarify or go back to that we covered and you thought?
All good.
Okay, that's great. And I think a final question that we ask all of our guests is if they have any recommendations in terms of media or books which interested listeners could go to regarding the contents of this episode.
Yeah, I think there's a book that I referenced called Behind Their Screens from Emily Weinstein and Carrie James that are all qualitative interviews with young people about their phone use, which I think are incredibly powerful and present their voices. There's a Substack newsletter from Jacqueline Nezi that discusses these questions in a really accessible way. So I would start with those.
Oh, great. This has been Cognitations. I've been chatting with Amy Orben. Thanks, Amy. Big time.
Thanks for having me.
On the next episode of Cognitations, we'll chat with Georgia Turner and Lucas Kunchera to explore how cognitive science theories can shed further light on social media's impact on mental health. If you're a methods or experimental enthusiast, this episode is not to be missed.